SELF 2023, or Southeast Linuxfest, was held in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's generally held in the early part of June, and SELF 2024 is scheduled for June 7th through 9th. I was able to attend SELF 2023, and so I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the experience overall, and also talk about some of the talks that I got to attend. Talks ranged from things like optimizing Linux for gaming, incorporating Linux and Windows, to Luke Smith talking about Suckless, and a discussion on the 5 concepts a developer needs to know. The first talk I attended was one about Linux's image, and one point that kind of stood out to me was the presenter was talking about how some more advanced Linux users will advise people to not use a certain distro or not run a certain command because, you know, it's too advanced for them or something like that. I really haven't heard this in the circles I tend to go in, but I'm sure that it has happened in certain areas of the internet. And so, you know, ultimately it was something where I kind of understood where they were coming from. Me personally, I wouldn't advise them not to run something like Arch, but I may advise them that it's going to be more difficult to get into as opposed to something like maybe Linux Mint. I didn't have the descriptions for each talk yet. I only had the actual titles. So there was one about something called Harvester, and it uses Kubernetes and other open source software, and it's kind of an infrastructure model. I'm interested in potentially going back and watching this one, and I will have the link to all the talks that I kind of mentioned that actually have links down in a pinned comment below. The next talk I went to was called Computer Science 101. It was a bit high level, but it did introduce me to the Go language, and it was interesting to kind of see that and hear it talked about in the wild. I don't really feel like many people talk about Go as, you know, much as I was hearing about it a couple years ago, though it does seem to be growing a bit more lately. And this is part of why I ended up taking a look at Go some in my 100 Days of Code. After lunch, I knew the presenter for the talk about Linux and Windows trying to coexist, and so I ended up going to that talk. I thought it was a solid talk. I wish they would have went a bit more in the other direction about, you know, having Linux and then occasionally needing Windows, because I'm looking at a project where I may occasionally need a Windows VM, but that would have been interesting to dive a bit further into, but they mostly focused on Windows and occasionally needing Linux. And I ended up the first day listening to Luke Smith talk about Suckless. And it was actually a really interesting talk. I had never really considered Suckless before this talk, but he ended up bringing up some interesting stuff that I really want to look at Suckless more. I'm not sure that it's going to be the right answer for me, but I at least want to keep that door open instead of just dismissing it because, you know, it just seems more intimidating than other window managers, for example, or other apps, for example. Saturday morning, I ended up going to the Optimizing Linux for Gaming talk, and the topics in that talk ranged from things like making sure you have enough swap, especially on lower end machines, and, you know, doing things like swappiness. And it went from, you know, simpler things like that all the way up to building your own version of the kernel. It was particularly interesting with the talk being led by Thomas Castleman, who is the lead developer for Draugr OS. I ended up missing a talk after this about Graphene OS. I really wish I would have went to this one, and I do plan to go back and watch it because I heard it was really good. The next talk I checked out was about TrueNAS Scale, and it was an interesting talk, but I don't think it quite convinced me that I need to add TrueNAS as my kind of go-to NAS option yet. I believe around this time there was also a talk about OpenVPN. I did not get to check it out, but I do want to go back and potentially watch it. Sunday morning, there was a talk about LXD containers. I thought it was pretty cool to see and just interesting to take a look at that side of things just because so many people have been focused on VMs. It was interesting to see the Linux container side of things. And the last talk I got to attend before I had to head to the airport was a talk called The 5 Gates of the Way by Eric S. Raymond. And you may know that name from the book, The Cathedral and the Bazaar. The main point of the talk centered around 5 key concepts that programmers need to learn to be good at their craft. As opposed to something like, you know, working on learning syntax and things like that, these were concepts that the person had to learn. It's like sequential assignment, recursion, pointers, closures, and finally concurrency. While the actual main part of the talk was one of the shorter ones, The discussion after was one of the longest because people were talking about potentially a sixth gate, and I even started wondering about things like conditionals and loops because I think those kind of may fit with sequential assignment, but I don't know. The other cool thing about going to an event like this is it's just interesting to see so many Linux users together, so many Linux users interacting, so many Linux users making, dumb Linux jokes. But the other cool part was I did get to meet Cubicle Nate for the first time in person. That was cool. And I also got to meet Noah from the Ask Noah show and pick his brain for a few minutes about a couple questions that I had about his setup there, because he had a pretty cool travel setup. Overall, I thought it was a really cool experience. I'm really hoping that I'll get to go back next year, and I'm also trying to think of a talk. So have you ever been to a Linux conference? Are there any that you're looking to go to? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and I will see you next time.